Welcome to Marriage and Family in a Global Context. This is Class 5. We're going to be covering the second part of the history of the family. So let's review before we get started. In Class 4, we learned about family structures across time and culture. So think about those different family structures that we talked about. Patriarchal family versus matriarchal family. Matrilocal family versus patriarchal family. We also define the functions of family across different family structures. So how is wealth accumulated and distributed among members of the family? That would be a key function of family that is unique across family structures across time and culture. We also explored the European, Native, colonial, and African origins of the American family, and we talked about the similarities and the differences and the unique challenges experienced by different families from these different origins. Now I want you to take a pause this video, and I want you to remind yourself about the terms related to family structure and function. Then I want you to think about your own family and define it using these terms. Is your family patriarchal or matriarchal? Is it patrilocal? Is it matrilocal? Think about things like that. Think about those terms and think about your own family. Apply what you learned in Class 4 to your own family. Pause the video, and when you're done with this quick little brain exercise, and let's get started with the lecture for today. So as we get started talking about the history of the family from the time of the American Revolution to the 1950s, we have to think about the family as changing to adapt to the rise in individual liberty. Until this point, the primary mode of governance was monarchy. People belonged to a nation that was ruled by a king or a queen, and that king or queen effectively owned them. They were effectively subservient and in servitude to that ruler. But when the United States was founded at the end of the American Revolution, it started a new form of governance that really took hold and began to change and transform the world in which people lived. And this was a democracy. And the main idea of democracy is the idea of individual freedom and liberation and self-determination. So individuals were viewed as being inherently free and being inherently endowed with the right to make decisions about their own lives. Though, pause, we have to acknowledge that this idea of democracy in 1776 was limited only to white people. Native Americans were not viewed as having the right to self-determination. Black people were not viewed as having the right to self-determination. And part of the evolving nature of these families that identify as Native American or Black or Asian or Mexican, as we'll talk today, part of their evolution as families was limited by the fact that the government didn't necessarily view them as equal partners in this new democracy project and this idea of personal liberty. We also have to remember that even though white people were seen as having the right to self-determination, the right to liberty, the right to make their own way in the world, this was still very limited in scope. The Declaration of Independence holds these ideas of liberty to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And men, obviously, during this time, the word men was used to describe both men and women instead of the way we use humanity today. But it's still, if you look at the way the law and the way the culture existed, women were still very largely subservient to men, and they were very reliant upon men. And we lived in a very patriarchal society until, about 50 years ago. So we have to remember that and keep that in our minds as we move forward talking about the history of the family, because this relationship between men and women and the relationship between a person's ethnicity and the market and the state really are going to determine how family evolved over the course of 100 years. Well, really over the course of 200 years, because we're moving rapidly through history. We're in the 1800s when we start here, and we're going to be ending up in the 1950s. So hold on to your hats. So with this rise and this in this idea that people are created equal and free to make their own way, there comes sort of this challenge to the way family has been viewed up to this point. And our book defines this view as a patriarchal view, because we're talking about the American family, which is largely influenced by the European family and the colonial family, and those had a very patriarchal system. So in this patriarchal view, then it's conflicting with this new egalitarian view. Egalitarian means we're all equal, we all deserve to be treated the same. So there's this conflict, and what would conflict theorists call this? They would call this a time for us to embrace change because we're about to move forward as a society. So in the patriarchal view, choosing partners was done for economic and political alliances. Your economic standing determined the power that you had in society. Well, in a society where everyone is equal, then it doesn't really matter if you're making an economically or politically advantageous marriage, because you're given the same rights regardless of how much money you have. So we see this change to really choosing partners for affection. We also see this, though, because there's an increase in industrialization during this time period. People are able to get jobs where they earn a wage instead of working the land in order to eat. So it isn't really that big a deal to have a partner if you were very poor, who would provide you with children and would provide you with additional labor, because it wasn't as necessary. Still a consideration. But there was more of a shift to choosing people that you actually liked and marry those people instead of people that you would like to be married to. Before, in this patriarchal view of family, marriages were arranged. Your parents really picked the people you marry. And this transition to this courtship. And a courtship is when you pick the one person you want to marry and you court them. You spend a lot of time with them and their family. You get to know each other to kind of confirm that they are the person you want to be with. And the family is still very involved in supervising this relationship and giving their input. So the courtship in and of itself is sort of this compromise between arranging your marriage and just everybody marries whoever they want to. Now, in this patriarchal view, the husband was the lord of the house. He was God's representative to the family. The wife had to obey him. But we see a transition to the husband as a protector. He's not really in charge of his wife in the same way. He protects her, but really in practice, he's still her lord. He still has a lot of authority over her. She's not a legal citizen technically. She's a citizen because she can't vote. He votes for her, so he's still her lord. But there's this idea that the culture changed their perspective. She doesn't really obey him because she's obedient, but because he protects her. She plays an equally important role as the nurturer of the family, but he protects the family. So we see this transition from wife as obedient to wife as an equal contributor. They operate in separate spheres. The husband is the economic provider. The wife is the family coordinator. She keeps the family moving forward. She nurtures the children. She takes care of the husband's needs, but he makes sure that she has the economic ability to do her job. So they both have equal jobs, and the wife was seen as an equal contributor. In the patriarchal view, children were seen as a legacy. How can we ensure our survival as a family? How can I perpetuate my progeny through a lot of different children? So you would have a lot of children, but we start to see the number of children go down as individual liberty increases, and children are cherished. We love our children. We invest in our children. We're not so much worried about how many children we have, but whether or not we have a close relationship with them. Now, that being said, there's still a lot of kids being had. I mean, it was not like 2.5 kids happened overnight. Just the rate of children being born decreases. Part of this was because of the actual manufacture of condoms, which happened in the mid-1800s. Who knew? Pretty cool, right? So people were actually already using birth control. They didn't want to have as many kids. They wanted to cherish the kids that they had. They also saw an increase in a decrease in the mortality rate. So in other words, kids didn't die as early. So you could have 5 kids and all of them, well, maybe not all of them, but most of them survive, as opposed to having to have 12 kids in your lifetime because maybe only 3 of them would survive. We also see a shift in the way children are viewed. So, in this patriarchal view that was largely informed by Calvinist theology, children are seen as these evils that have to be tamed. And it's the role of the parents to tame the evil, to mold their children from these evil, self serving beings into productive members of society. But we see a shift where we see children as blank slates. They're not born evil, they're just born like impressionable, and the way that you raise them is going to determine whether or not they're productive members, not how well you tame their evil nature and desires. So we see a shift from this patriarchal view where we have authoritarian discipline. You do what I say or I'm going to beat you, or you do what I say because I told you to authoritative discipline, which is actually, if you take developmental psychology, you'll learn it's actually much better for a child in the long run. Authoritative is more, you're going to do what I tell you to do. Here's why I'm telling you to do it. And if not, there's a consequence. So it's similar to authoritarian, but authoritarian is more harsh. It's like you do what I say because I say it, as opposed to here, I'm going to mold you. I'm going to be your moral guide. I'm going to explain to you why what you're doing is wrong. I'm going to set reasonable boundaries for you, and you're going to follow them, or there will be a consequence. Now, the reason we see a lot of this, and I've alluded to this before, is within the institutional arena of the family, there are some major shifts that are happening. So prior to this point, the family is the primary institutional arena. Labor happens in the family. Intimate things happen in the family. Nurturing, growth, education happen in the family. But when we start to see a rise in industrialization, and that is like the production of things in factories, the spread of like people moving to cities and living in urban areas instead of more agrarian society, we see a shift from the family to the market as the primary arena for economic gain and for labor. And with this shift, we see the separation of men and women into different spheres. Men worked in the market. They went to the factories. They worked in the offices. Women stayed in the home. They were the leader of the family in the husband's absence. They were responsible for maintaining the home and taking care of the kids and doing all the nurturing, intimate things that happen within the home. Now, women, because we're in this increased industrialization, we need a lot of hands to labor. Women could still work in the market. A woman, especially younger women, were needed to do things like some factory work, like sewing and things like that. I mean, they also did other things, but women typically did more genteel, quote unquote, labor than men did. They also were teachers and nurses. They did things like that in fields where we still see a high percentage of women doing those kinds of jobs. But there was a catch. You could only do that if you were not married. The minute you got married, you could no longer work because your appropriate sphere was the family. So women could work in the market provided that they were, provided that they weren't married. Now, again, we have to talk about social class. The lower the class, the more this line is going to be blurred. Women may have to work. They may not have the luxury of staying home in the same way men did. Again, social class changes everything, but we'll be talking about that more in some chapters coming up. Now, while these separate spheres were seen to be equal, and women were seen to be providing an equal contribution as men, there still was increased gender inequality. Why is this? Because the work women did in the family did not produce wages. Men produced wages by working in the market sphere. And so men still had a disproportionate amount of economic power over women because women couldn't earn their own way. They were completely dependent upon the man providing the resources that she needed. So if he was a brute and didn't take care of her, she was literally left with no recourse. She couldn't go out and earn her own wage. She was completely at his mercy. Women also didn't have the same political agency that men did. They weren't able to vote. They weren't able to voice their opinion in public in the same way men could. And so they were still completely under the subjection of men because they relied upon their husband or their father, whoever the man in their life was, to provide that agency for them. And that's a process called coverture. That's what that's called when your political agency is derived from someone else, not from your own self. So, like, children have no political agency until they turn 18. They're reliant upon the political agency of their parents. That would be an modern day example of coverture. We also see a shift in the state's role in the family. So previously, the state had somewhat of a role, but it wasn't that involved in the life of the family. If you wanted your family to have an education, if you wanted your family to be taken care of, if you died, like if the husband died, since men were the wage earners, um, that was up to you. The family was completely isolated. The state didn't really play a huge role. The state, quote unquote, played a role in defining who could get married, but that was about it. Um, but we see a shift as we move from the beginning of the 1800s to the beginning of the 1900s. We see this huge shift where the state provides more oversight into the lives of families. So the husband was still universally recognized as the authority of the family and was the sole political citizen in the household. So his sons, when they reached the age of majority, obviously became citizens or were seen as citizens, political citizens, but the wife, regardless of her age, did not. So if a woman was widowed and had no adult sons, she had no political agency. The husband was seen as the authority of the family and the sole citizen. But through a series of decisions, the state began to force moral monogamy on people. So monogamy was pretty much what was practiced in North America, but there was some pockets of polygamy, notably in the early Mormon church as it moved west towards Utah. There was a lot of polygamy. There were some Native American nations that practiced polygamy. So it wasn't like monogamy was the only form of marriage that existed in North America. But the federal government began to pass legislation that sort of pushed without requiring monogamy. So, for example, if certain Native American nations wanted access to citizenship rights, they could only be in monogamous marriages. The state of Utah, the only way that it became a state was if the Mormon church said, we're not going to practice polygamy anymore. So the state was able to force this sort of this view, this function, this structure of marriage on the society as a whole by passing legislation that didn't directly say you had to be monogamous, but removed a lot of privileges if you didn't. The state also prohibited birth control in many different instances by legislating what kind of birth control could exist and how it could be obtained. So, for example, the use of contraceptive sheaths or condoms was practiced, but you couldn't obtain them unless you were married. So, like, it wasn't like today where anybody can go buy a condom, a package of condoms, or even get them for free in some places. You had to be married. They had to be prescribed to you by a doctor. Pretty cool, huh? Actually, not cool. Why do you think people had so many kids? Birth control was hard to get. Before this period, if you were left a widow or an orphan, you were completely reliant upon your family to ensure your survival. So your extended family largely took over that role. And if you want to see what this looks like, read some Jane Austen novels. They're not American novels, but they clearly demonstrate the vulnerability of women during this period. If a woman was widowed, like in the book Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, great book that talks about widows and orphans and what happens when you're from a wealthy family, but your husband dies. The wife and her daughters are totally dependent upon the goodwill of a wealthy male relative to take care of them. And that's something that we saw in America, the early American family. But we start to see this shift as we move closer to the 1900s, where the state begins to take care of widows and orphans. Part of the way that the Union was able to get soldiers to fight in the Civil War was they promised them that their widows would have a pension if something happened to them. So we start to see widows' pensions. We start to see state-supported orphanages and poorhouses that provided a very limited source of welfare for people who maybe didn't have an extended family to take care of them or had an extended family who could take care of them. Especially if your extended family were all poor and you were poor, well, I mean, you're kind of in the same boat, right? So the state started to step in and help out in a way that they never had before. So let's now shift our focus. We've talked a lot about, in general terms, about what family looked like and the shifts that occurred in families. But we have to really pay attention and focus in on minority families, because minority families were not given the same legal protections or the same social privileges that white families were. So we ended last time, we talked about how black families were kind of in this disorganized, chaotic, oppressive, atrocity state because they were being ripped from their culture, they're being ripped from one another. There's no legal marriage for black people, at this point, when we ended last time. And I said it's going to be very hard to talk about the family and their evolution, the black family and their evolution, until the end of slavery. Because when slavery ended, it changed a lot of things. It didn't change everything, and things didn't get better. Things have still not gotten better for black families, and it's 2020. And you will see that as we progress throughout this course. The effects of slavery and the effects of what happened after slavery are still being worked out in the black family of the 21st century. So 1865, we're halfway through the 1800s, slavery has been outlawed in the United States. The slave trade was outlawed, the international or the Atlantic slave trade, it was ended much earlier than this, but the domestic slave trade centered in Montgomery, Alabama, by the way. Interesting fact, Montgomery, Alabama was the capital of the domestic slave trade. Was not outlawed until 1865, and people could be held in slavery until then. So you would think, okay, slavery's over, black people are equal to white people. That is not what happened. This did not end the racist, economic, and legal oppression of black individuals and families. And spoiler alert, this economic and legal oppression is still happening in 2020. What we saw is a transition from slavery to sharecropping, which was just a new form of slavery. I'm calling it economic slavery. Sharecropping was where you were given a piece of land, but it was owned by some white people, and you worked for them, and you had to give them a percentage of your crop. And that was your rent, basically. But the percentage that you had to give was so much that you could never get ahead. You could never make enough money to buy your own land. So essentially, you were still slaves. You just were not owned. Like you could say, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm going to another farm, but it was the same exact arrangement. You were pretty much stuck where you were doing exactly what you'd been doing before. The only difference is they had to treat you somewhat better, but it wasn't much better, let's be honest. Citizenship and voting rights were not guaranteed. Black people did not have were not fully integrated into our fully enfranchised into our political system until much later. I don't know the exact date. I think it was the 14th Amendment. There was a good several generations when black people were no longer slaves, but they also weren't full citizens and they didn't have the right to vote. And they were living in this sharecropping economic slavery model. Their equality in the market was non-existent. They could be paid less than white people, they couldn't even get the same jobs as white people, and they weren't even allowed to go into the same places as white people. And if you want to say, well, that was just in the South, that's actually a lie. That's across the country. Even in the North, where slavery had been outlawed for a long time and not practiced, black people were still treated as lesser than white people. And so they didn't have access to all of the resources and the benefits that white families did, and so their evolution as a family unit took a much different path. Now, some of the benefits of slavery being ended were that family life got a lot easier. Now, that being said, that is kind of an ironic statement. When the alternative was being owned and ripped from your family without notice or consent, anything is better than that. Any improvement is vastly better than that. So the first benefit of slavery ending on the family is that legal marriage was a possibility. Not only was it a possibility, but it was actually encouraged. The federal government would give more benefits to you if you were married. And so a lot of black people were able to get married to people who they'd been married to already, but it wasn't previously a legal marriage. The other great benefit is families could stay together. Nobody was going to rip your family apart. Now, obviously, the modern welfare state has kind of changed that because the state takes people away from their kids all the time. But compared to what had existed before, families could stay together. And in this way, black families were equal to white families in that they had a little bit more of that protection, that the family was seen as an integral unit that could not be infringed upon. Now, because black families evolved in a separate sphere than white families, they formed unique structures and functions that we didn't see in white families in the same way. First of all, there was high gender equality in black marriages. And that was because there was very little equality in the market. So basically, you had pretty much an equal chance of getting a job if you were a black man or a black woman, and they shared the load a lot easier, or a lot more fairly for that reason. Another huge and important structure and function in the black family is the extended family. So we see a shift in white families away from the extended family, but we see a shift towards the extended family in black families, and that is still true to this day. Black extended families are much more important than white extended families. And this was because they needed a lot more support. And so they really relied on each other in a way that was different than white families, who were having access to more benefits from the market and the state than black families did. However, black families were more prone to tension created by a lack of legal equality. So black marriages were more likely to fail than white marriages, not because they didn't make equally good partners, but because they were bombarded with poverty. They were bombarded with inequality a lot more, and it was just so many stressors that caused all marriages to collapse, or being piled on them at much higher rates than white families. And so that was one of the downsides for black families. Black women were also more likely to be widowed than white women because of poverty. Largely, poverty lowers your life expectancy. Poverty increases the likelihood that you're going to be widowed. That's just the way that it is. And men tend to die earlier than women because they tend to do more abrasive work than women. So, unfortunately, because black women were largely or black families were largely lived in extreme poverty, black women were more likely to be widowed. But black families are not the only minorities that we were seeing in the United States. Asia, we started to see immigration from Asia in the mid-1800s. In 1852, the first Asian immigrants arrived in the western United States from China, and they came to work in the California gold rush. But when we talk about Asian families and we talk about Asian American families, we have to understand that they looked considerably different than anything that we had seen on this continent before. And that was because Asian men tended to come without their families. And they were coming to work and earn a wage, and then they would eventually go home. Or their family would come to join them once they had some economic and social stability. And this is where we get the study of split household families. And this is where, in this specific definition, husband and family are separated for years due to the husband's working arrangements. We still see this today. We still see split family household families across the board, no matter what your race or immigration status is. We have families where maybe two people are in highly specific fields and they aren't able to get a job in the same place. So the family is separated by maybe hours and hours of driving, or even like a long plane ride, because of the way that the market was, and where the husband and wife, or the husbands or the wives, could find work. And so they're separated by physical distance. This is called a split household family, and we first started to see this with these Asian immigrants in 1852. Now that good old, and I say it very sarcastically, American institution of racism put a huge wrench in these works. These Asian Americans were hard workers, and because the gold rush was bringing a lot of wealth, there was a lot of jealousy. Jealousy and racism are horrible companions with one another, and racism targeted these new Americans in 1882. As a result, the United States stopped immigration from Asia. No new Chinese people could come to California to work. And what did this mean? It meant that families remained separated. If you wanted to stay and work, your family had to stay in China or whatever Asian country you were from. Um, so a lot of Asian men were either stuck without their families or they were stuck without a family at all because they weren't married before they came. And to make sure, and because racism is all about consolidating and preserving systems of power, to make sure that these Asian men did not produce children and then produce this new ethnic group in the United States, laws were put in place that prevented Asian men from marrying white women. So they were stuck completely alone. And so, do you think that they stayed? Who knows? I don't know. It depends on how much they wanted to get married and have kids. I would guess if you really wanted to get married and have kids and you weren't allowed to, then you probably left. Now, the Chinese Americans are not the only Asian group here. They were the largest group in the late 1800s. And we'll see as we progress through our history, the history and culture of the family in the United States, we'll start to see the emergence of other Asian groups, like the Japanese, who also were very prevalent in the Western United States as it began to grow and to become part of our country. We also have to talk about Latino families. And we need to talk about them, one, because they were part of this emerging American story in the late 1800s, but also because they're still part of our American story today. And there's a lot of similarities about how Latino Americans were treated in the mid 1800s and how they're treated now in 2020. Now, it's important to note that the earliest group of Mexican Americans did not immigrate to the United States. There is a large percentage of our Latino population in the United States today that are just as American as I am. They've been here just as long, their ancestors were here just as long as mine were. And that's because Mexico, half of Mexico in the 1800s included part of what is now the United States. So Mexican citizens became U.S. citizens as half of Mexico was annexed, won, or purchased by the U.S. between 1845 and 1853. And to give you a clear picture of what that is, everything within the red was part of Mexico until 1853. And so that was not an uninhabited wild wasteland. I mean, people lived there. There were cities, there were communities, there were people doing their thing, and they were Mexicans because Mexico owned that land. And so suddenly, between 1845 and 1853, these new Americans became strangers in their own homes, in homes that maybe they'd inhabited for generations. Because suddenly the government was different, new people were moving in, and they were taking control of like the local community and the local land. So a lot of these Mexican Americans lost their legal standing. They lost their prominence. They lost their jobs and their livelihoods and their culture as America annexed their areas, their communities, and made them part of the United States. So there was lots of legal standing. There was lots of jobs. When you lose your legal standing and you lose your jobs, you start to see an increase in poverty. And when you see an increase in poverty, you start to see more family separation. So a lot of these Latinos either went back to Mexico or went to what was left of Mexico, I should say, or they spread out among the territory of the growing United States of America. So now that all happened in the mid 1800s, and as we start to move into the 1900s, we start to see this shift towards the 1950s ideal. And I'm re-showing you this picture that we started our discussion of the family with a couple days ago of the ideal 1950s family. Now this is the goal. This is where family has been moving since the Declaration of Independence was written. And this is the evolution of the family as a result of all the things we've just talked about. We've shifted from this family that was largely built on economic purposes and along economic lines and along class divide. But we move towards this ideal of the companionship family, which is a family where all members are equal and bound by mutual affection and comradeship. Now, that sounds really nice, and that sounds like something we would all want. But as we start to explore the family, this 1950s ideal, and we start to move towards to 2020 in our next class, you'll start to see that a lot of this ideal, a lot of this niceness in this companionship family model is more of a myth than it is a reality. So let's compare the patriarchal family as it evolved in the 1800s to the 1950s ideal family, or the companionship family, as it evolved across the early 19 to the mid 1900s. So in this patriarchal family, we see your spouse is chosen by parental influence, social status, and economic needs. Now, I said earlier that we'd seen a shift, and we had seen a shift. The egalitarian family shifted considerably from where the patriarchal family had been, in the pre-1800s. But even so, your spouse was still largely chosen by your influence of your parents, by the social status that you had, and by the economic needs that you had. But as we move into the 1900s and the mid 1900s, we see spouse being chosen more by self-directed motivation, by your own decisions, by your own actions, and it was largely based on how much you had affection for that person and whether or not you liked their personality. Now, you've discovered that in the patriarchal family through courtship, where you picked one person and you pretty much lavished all your attention on them within the context of the family home until you made a decision for sure you wanted to marry them and you were able to economically. We see a shift from that into dating, where you see multiple people, and usually outside of the context of the home, and you kind of see what you like and you don't like through these intimate relationships, but still, there's still boundaries. It's like not as intimate as they are now. But dating was much more intimate than courtship was, because you were able to see multiple people. You're courting multiple people at the same time. We see a shift from the subordination of the wife, so the wife is legally and socially and financially dependent on the husband, to equality based on consensus. This goes back to that consensus perspective that we talked about a couple days ago. Society agreed on the roles of men and women, husbands and wives, and everybody is equal because we all agree that those are the roles that we have. There's no inequality because we don't disagree, right? Wrong. Equality exists whether or not people agree it does. So women got the right to vote in the 1900s. They were given the same political agency that men were. So they were no longer subordinate to a husband. They could work outside the home a lot more, but still there were a lot of limitations. Most women did not work after they got married because it wasn't what was socially expected of them. We see a shift in family authority, and what bonds and what keeps families together. So in the patriarchal family, the father's authority, the father being in charge of you and being your political and financial agent, that shifted to where now families are bonded because they actually like each other and they have common goals. So the family cohesion exists because we like each other, not because the father says what to do and we obey it. Now, in the patriarchal family, we started to see a shift from the extended family being important and the extended family not playing as much of a role in family life. In the 1900s, that is pretty much the case. The nuclear family is more important. Your immediate family, the people, your parents and your siblings, that's what's important. That's what the focus is on. Extended family is not as involved. And that involvement of the extended family gets less and less and less, in white families at least, as we progressed closer to the late 1900s. And then, of course, the goal of the family. Why does the family exist? What is the family working for? In the patriarchal family, that was duty and tradition. We want to be the family that our ancestors were and what they dreamed for us. That is our duty to them. That is the tradition that we uphold. But as we move into the companionship family, of the 1900s, The family's goal, the family works together not to maintain a tradition or duty, but to create happiness and personal growth for the family and for all the people in the family. And this is all happening as a result of a lot of different political and social things that are happening. You have to remember, we fought two major world wars in the early 1900s. That increased industrialization. More women had to work because men were off fighting. Men came back having seen the horrors of war, and they wanted something more than this sort of narrow, rigid patriarchal family. They wanted to enjoy and love and celebrate the things that they had sacrificed years of their life for and their health for. We see an increase in children. I mean, this is when the baby boom happened. A lot of children are born as a result of this change and this shift and desire and focus away from the ways of the past and looking more towards the goals of the future. You also have to remember war is, this class isn't about war and whether or not it's a good or bad thing. War destroys a lot of things, but it also creates a lot of things. We see a huge increase in technology as a result of war. And a lot of the technology that we have now, we have because of the technology that we got from the First and Second World Wars, becoming part of the civilian marketplace and not just exclusively in the military marketplace. So we see a huge increase in technology, and this increase in technology makes life easier. So this is making family shift its focus and shift its priority because suddenly life is easier and more enjoyable than it had been in the past. Okay, so for next time, I want you to email me any questions that you have about this class or any of the classes that came before, and I'm happy to answer those. Remember that your homework is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. So finish that homework and get it turned in on time. Be sure to read pages 59 to 75 in your textbook and then watch Class 6 lecture. Thanks for your attention and your time today. I hope you enjoyed class as much as I did, and I'll see you for Class 6. Have a good evening.